Hello there. Good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is. Thank you so much for watching. So, in this reflection, this kind of learning journal, video learning journal vlog thing, just want to reflect on this week's assignment. So, week 2 of American history. It's pretty amazing. We spent a lot of time focusing on essentially what was a very important topic in early colonial America, and that was the slave trade and slavery as an institution, how that affected our nation and its founding up until about the time that we began our revolution with England. So starting off, we go back to, again, the 1600s up until right about the 1660s, and that's where I learned one of like the most astounding facts for me was again, there was virtually no distinction at that point in time between the types of slavery in America and in the world at large, really. So you had your African slaves, which again I knew about African slaves for a long time. You had Native American slaves, which I really didn't even think about, to be honest. So to me, it was almost a shock, even though it makes sense to hear about Native American slaves. And then you had even white slaves and indentured servants who were indistinguishable until the 1660s, which is an interesting thing because at that point, going back to like what I mentioned last week in my last reflection, was that Britain had this class system, super complex. I only named like 3 parts, but there was new money, old money, and all this super complex class system in the UK that wasn't as prevalent in the US, but in the Americas in early colonial times, a lot of that carried over. So the poor people of other colors, people that were conquered in battle, so Native Americans, and then Africans, and all these people they were considered lower class. They were considered slaves, and there was almost no distinction. Big change came in the 1660s when essentially the white slaves and indentured servants were petitioning and fighting to have their daughters moved indoors. So there began this bill that was passed where basically white women working the fields were taken out of the fields and put into dairy sheds and put into the interior in the plantation homes, and they were forced to work indoors, and that was the very first distinction in the reading, at least. So in the reading that we covered, it was the very first distinction I really noticed between skin color and becoming race. Um, as we developed more as a nation, a lot of plantation owners, especially on rice plantations, cotton plantations, tobacco plantations, they began having this problem. And that problem was that a lot of their slaves were dying off. They were dying, committing suicide. They were getting sick, dying of exhaustion and heat stroke. So Native Americans were super susceptible. Even the white indentured servants were super susceptible. But the Africans were resilient and had become prized because of this resilience. So they became the primary focus of the slave trade because in this week's readings, the amazing transition of the people being marched across the continent of Africa, across their countries, away from their villages, their homelands, being purchased from the tribes who were victorious over them in battle, sold onto these ships where they made the Middle Passage, which was the second step of their journey. First, you had the first journey across the continent, across the country, whatever it might be. Middle Passage was the second step of the journey. Middle Passage was absolutely abhorrid. Squalid conditions in the bottoms of these ships, strapped up where the swaying and the rocking of the ship was just absolutely causing all this like this chafing from the chains, the chafing from the wood that they were sitting up against, so crowded that you couldn't even move. And the people were just, again, malnourished. They weren't fed. There were people laying in pools of excrement from dysentery that they were dying of. It was an absolutely horrible condition to be in. It was a horrible time in history. And if you were unlucky enough to survive that journey, you got into the colonies in the Americas, and you had to go through a period of seasoning where they would begin putting you to work and preparing you for work and teaching you work if you didn't know it already or have this trade. So it was a very rough 3-step process for African slaves that were brought through. And even after going through that entire process of coming from Africa across the sea and then landing on our continent and then being put into these plantations, if that wasn't enough, they were worked to death on these plantations, and the African slaves were still the most resilient versus the Native American who was captured maybe just a few miles away from where they're forced to work, who die of heat stroke and exhaustion because of how hard they're pushed. The Africans still were able to work. So then it became about African slaves were prized. It became about them being the ones that all the plantation owners wanted because they were the least likely to die. They were really good at farming rice because they had the skill. They were farming rice back in their homeland. So they were skilled at farming rice, and they were naturally resistant to some of the diseases that you would find in the tropical climates of the southern colonies. So they made great rice plantation slaves, and then they were really good on a lot of the tobacco plantations as well. So that is when we first began to see this classification and distinction between race. Now, outside of that slavery side, I also really liked what we started covering as we're preparing for the political climate of what brings about the revolution. So as we're getting into more of the 1700s now, early 1700s, and the wars that were happening with the French, and seeing what happened when they were conquered, and you had French Canada to our north, right? And it's just amazing to see the political climate shifting ever so slowly. So we had to fight in this war. We had to participate in this war because, again, French Canada was just to our north. So we are expending resources. Britain's expending resources. And at the end of it all, the British defeat the French. French surrender. Colonies are victorious. Britain is victorious. And Britain is now going to expect the colonists, whose reputation has become kind of strange now because we've gone through a few generations now. So a lot of these people were born here, and the crown's kind of stripping away some of the birthrights of the people who should be considered British. So they're no longer British. They're not, so what are they? And they're beginning to become known as Americans, because they're being born in the American colonies, the Americas. So these people begin being known as Americans. They're beginning to feel a little bit estranged from the British. They're beginning to notice a lot of the pressures that the crown is putting on our liberties. Some of the best parts of living in the colonies was the fact that you were a little bit freer. You had a lot more liberty than people who lived in a more controlled colony, like some of the colonies that we see down in the Caribbean and the Andes. So after this war, things really start coming to a head because now Britain is expecting these American colonists, who technically are still British, but as far as the class system goes, these are really the lowest form of British you can get. Like, they're barely British. And so they began to impose heavy, heavy, heavy taxes and levies because now America has to help pay for the war. The American colonies have to help pay for the war. They're part of the crown. We fought to defend you, so you're going to help, and you're going to put some money into this thing. So the Americans have to pay all these more taxes. These American colonists have to pay more taxes. So that's when you really start to see a lot of the winding up of like the boycotting of tea, the boycotting of stamps, the boycotting of a lot of the products that had been deemed almost necessary, but they were still luxury, they were still comforts. I've actually heard people say that the boycotting tea and the Boston Tea Party, everything that happened there, really helped to shape the American love of coffee. So at this point in history, right there, 1775-ish, we are on the brink of revolution. We're on the brink of fighting back against the British because of the heavy weight that has been placed upon us and our land as Americans. We're at that point again. I think that two main key points out of that are that we were barely considered British. Most people didn't consider us British. We were a couple generations in. People considered us Americans. And the second thing is the heavy weight that they placed upon us to impose more of that imperial rule that the Americas lacked. Because we had all these liberties, we were much more of a free mindset, a libertarian mindset in a way. And we didn't want to give up those liberties. So people like Benjamin Franklin began speaking out and began getting together and hosting sort of this American government between the colonies. And we really see that play out more into, I imagine, what we're going to be studying next week. But I absolutely loved everything that we talked about this week. I loved the reading. And again, something that always surprises me is I go in and I see this huge, long list of reading. And somebody like myself, I am married, so I have a wife that I'm trying to maintain a relationship. I also have a full-time job, pulling cable and stuff. I have 4 children and a church to serve in, and I'm taking a full-time course load. So I look at this long article or chapter in our reading, and I just say, good golly, this is going to be tough. And I start reading, and next thing you know, 6 hours have passed. I've just been lost in history reading through this, and it's just absolutely amazing to me because it's all so fresh. Like I said, I feel like I've been taught this before younger, and I just have forgotten so much that reading it all again is just making it so fresh to me. And learning about my origins, the political climate of Britain. These are some conversations I would have loved to have had with my stepfather if he was still here. So it's just exciting for me, and it makes me really proud of this country, proud to be an American. A weird thing to make me feel patriotic after reading about something as horrid as slavery for so many hours. But the point being is that I'm excited to be studying, I'm excited to be growing, and I absolutely loved this week's content because it helped to widen my perspective and educate me on a lot of things. So thank you so much for watching this video. I'm looking forward to next week, and I hope that you enjoyed this reflection and that it made a little bit of sense. Thank you so much.